Hi, my name is Valerie Worthington, and this is the latest in a series of conversations I'm getting to have with some of my friends and colleagues through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the mentality or the mindset is if we can't train with each other, which we can't because of the quarantine, then we might as well communicate with each other in other ways. And so today I get to talk to Julia Kelly, who is a delightful person and who has some useful professional and educational background that we're going to talk about in a minute. So, Julia, thank you for talking with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. So, the first question I have for you is say a little bit about your jujitsu background.
So I am a blue belt under Tim Hart in Conshohocken, which is a Balance affiliate. I've been training for about 4, almost 5 years. Um, and I've met a ton of amazing people, yourself included. And it's kind of what's getting me through this quarantine. I was looking through my text messages today, and I'd say about 80% of them are people that I train with. Those are the people I'm keeping in contact with. Um, so yeah, it's a big part of my life that unfortunately can't do right now.
That's on hold for a little bit, yeah. And those are the people who understand what you're going through, not being able to train. I wanted to say, I was at your, I think your blue belt promotion. It might have been the first time we met. And I think I trained with you after you'd been training for like 45 minutes straight, and you just had this tenacity. And it was really cool and also scary. And I was like, I'm just exhausted training with her. So it was a really fun way to be introduced to you. And I look forward to the next time we get to train. So so your experience during the quarantine is probably different from many people's. I'd like to ask you to say a little bit about what you do professionally and what your educational and professional background are.
Yeah, so I have been going into work every day, just about every day since this started, because I am a scientist working as a contractor at Merck in their vaccine labs. So I studied molecular biology in undergrad, as well as chemistry. And I spent several years working as a diagnostic technician. So I'm certified by the American Society for Clinical Pathology in molecular biology testing. And for the last year or so, yeah, it was a year right when everything kind of got shut down. I've been working at Merck in the lab that helps get vaccines through clinical trials. So, molecular biology is really important for making sure that the vaccines are working and also that they're safe. So, we mostly look at preclinical, so animal models, and also the phase 1 trials. So, that's making sure that it's safe in healthy humans and also looking at preliminary data to make sure that it's working enough to move on to the next trial.
So you were working on vaccines before the COVID-19 epidemic hit,
Mhm.
is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so how has your professional life changed in the face of all of this?
Um, so my actual job has not changed too much because a lot of what I do and a lot of what my lab does is making sure that everything we do is up to FDA standards. So we're not stopping that. We're still trying to meet the same very rigorous standards that the FDA has set for all of our vaccine production. Um, the big thing is we are practicing social distancing in the labs, and a lot of that means we're working with a reduced crew. So we're staggering shifts, or we're making sure to schedule certain people on certain floors in the labs, and also staggering working from home, um, just to make sure that nothing starts getting passed around in the labs, just like outside.
For sure. And so for people who don't know much about um, empirical research, what is a typical day like for you, if there is
Um,
such a
so I would say there are two typical days for me. The first one is, like I mentioned before, making sure that we're keeping everything up to code for the FDA. So a lot of that is we get chemicals and reagents from various companies, and we have to test them and make sure that the company made them correctly or that nothing happened in shipment. Because if we then go into testing with a reagent that's not up to par, then it's not going to do what it needs to, and that could cause problems downstream. And then the other part is testing clinical samples. So each vaccine program has its own set of standards that it has to meet, and the clinical samples that we receive change depending on that vaccine. So if it's something in the blood, we're going to get blood samples. If it's something that's like a respiratory tract infection, like the COVID virus, so we would get the throat swabs or a nasal swab. And for other diseases, we might actually get tissue depending. So we have to process that depending on the type of tissue. And then they all have different types of tests that we have to run. We don't do diagnostic testing in my lab, but actually a lot of the tests are like the COVID-19 testing that they're running right now. It's a very similar platform. But again, the FDA is very stringent on who's allowed to do clinical testing. So labs have to be pre-certified for that.
So when you say that you're not doing diagnostic testing, does that mean you're not testing samples to see if they have the virus, but you're using those samples to see if you could, if you and your team could eventually come up with a vaccine?
That's a really good question. Actually, what it means is clinicians can't make any clinical decisions off of any data that we give them. So that data is solely for empirical research that the clinical teams are doing to see, is this vaccine working? Is it not? The clinician can't use it in any of their treatment.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, is because obviously I have a layperson understanding of all of this. You mentioned that the FDA has really stringent requirements for something like the development of a vaccine, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those are, what the steps are. And the reason for the question is, I'm sure you hear people are complaining or they're wondering when a vaccine is going to be available. And of course, we all want that, but we want it to be something that's going to work and that's going to be safe.
Right, exactly. So that's also a really good question, because it is frustrating that they're saying like it could be a year and a half or longer for this vaccine to be licensed. But if it's licensed in a year and a half, that'll be 3.5 years faster than the second fastest vaccine licensing ever. So that would be, and it looks like we can do it. There's a lot of vaccines currently in production. I think there are 41 currently in preclinical and clinical trials. But what we have to do is we have to make sure that, one, we're giving people a safe vaccine, and two, we're giving them a vaccine that works, because we don't want to vaccinate them, tell them you're safe now, you're not going to get the virus, have them go out, and then they get infected. So that's what the clinical trials are looking at. So phase 1 is solely, is this safe? We give it to healthy individuals, usually between 20 to 40, follow them for a couple weeks, make sure that there's no immediate danger in vaccinating. And this safety thing continues throughout the entire clinical trial process. We don't just stop at phase 1. When we move into phase 2, we're still evaluating safety, but that's also when we're starting to evaluate, are these people producing the antibodies? So that's the body's natural defense mechanism against the virus. How many are they producing, and how long are those antibodies sticking around? We're also looking for, and this is where I'd come in, we would be looking for, do these people have the virus after they're vaccinated? Because if you have the virus, obviously it's not working. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it's actually really interesting. Right now, there are, as I mentioned, there's 41 different types of vaccines in production, and 2 types of those vaccines. So there's an RNA vaccine and a DNA vaccine that are currently in phase 1 clinical trials. We've never had an RNA or DNA vaccine licensed in human beings before, just because we've never really had a time to make it work. And if we can get, the RNA vaccine is actually the most promising one. Usually we go for a protein. So a lot of people talk about the spike protein in the coronavirus. because that's what our cells are going to recognize and say, that doesn't belong here, we need to attack it. But if we're looking at the RNA, there's less chance of an adverse reaction, so there's less chance that our body will overreact. Um, but it could actually provide a stronger immune response. So that's actually really exciting to watch. And also, I mean, it's exciting for a vaccine person. I know for everyone, I know for me, it's scary this whole time, but just watching that and seeing if we can finally get that platform to work, that'll make vaccines so much faster to produce. The mRNA vaccine in clinical trials took 90 days from sequencing into clinical trials. For most vaccines, that takes about 6 months.
You said that if this happens in a year and a half, then that would still be what did you say, 3 years faster than the second fastest?
Yeah.
That is really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is honestly something we've been preparing for. Like we didn't know what the disease was going to be. Flu, coronavirus. We've been looking at coronavirus since the SARS outbreak in 2003, but scientists have always known that there was going to be something coming. Diseases show up in the human population every so often, and we knew that our usual vaccine production schedule wouldn't be fast enough. So since SARS, roughly, scientists have been trying to figure out a way to make vaccines faster and roll them out so that if there is a pandemic like COVID, it's not going to be the normal 5 year waiting period for a vaccine.
That is pretty amazing. And is it accurate to say that there are attempts going on around the world? And is there any sort of coordination among those attempts? Like what kinds of communications are you and your group having with other groups?
So my group specifically, not so much, but in general, there is a ton of communication around the world. Science doesn't, Scientists don't like boundaries, like national boundaries very much because we know that each country has a lot to offer. So what we want to do is collaborate with the best scientists around the world, have the best people working on it, um, and not let politics get in the way because the idea of vaccines is saving lives before people get sick. And it's really not a political thing, even if some people try and make it political.
That's a perfect segue into the next question I was going to ask. Again, I'm assuming that you hear that people question sources and they're not trusting the information that they receive. And from your perspective as a professional and as someone who has a background in this area, where are the credible sources that people can go to keep themselves informed?
So definitely the World Health Organization and the CDC are going to have the most timely and the most accessible information. So they're making sure they're putting out information that everyone can understand and kind of relate to. If you want a little bit more in depth, so if you're looking to follow the clinical trials and developments on what we know about the virus, I look at JAMA, so the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Lancet. All three of those they usually have commentaries and editorials that are less the scientific paper that is really annoying to get to, even if you're a scientist. And they're also making most of their COVID stuff free. Also, Dr. Fauci, who is everyone's favorite scientist now, I'm a big fan of his because he kind of just gives the information like it is. There's no hype. He doesn't really downplay it. He doesn't upplay it. And he's been in that job since the mid 80s. So he kind of knows what he's talking about. Um, if you're looking for more like big media, New York Times and Washington Post usually have pretty good information. I know some people don't like their politics, but they also just have articles that are just about what we know and they do their fact checking. Um, and as for the other ones like CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all reporting without having an in-depth understanding of the science. So I even catch myself sometimes. I'll like read a headline and I'm like, that sounds terrible. I think we're all going to die. And then I'm like, oh no, you have to go evaluate where they're getting it from. Is it one study that has like 5 patients enrolled? Are they quoting one scientist who probably doesn't even have that prestigious of a job? Because right now you want to have the top experts being quoted in the media. So you can definitely get your information from there, but I always take it with a grain of salt.
And it's so interesting that there are now two reasons to want the top experts, right? The one reason is because you want the best people who are going to give the best information, or that have the best grasp of what's going on. But you also want people who are trustworthy, who may be able to kind of break through the suspicions of people who, as you said, are worried that somehow the virus is being politicized. So,
Exactly.
yeah. So, what is you said that you're working with a skeleton crew, and obviously you're considered essential personnel because of what you're working on, and you're going in every day. Um, so a skeleton crew is what does that entail, and then what are your safety precautions that you're taking to make sure that that you stay safe, that the people you're working with stay safe, that the laboratories are clean, etc.
So as far as the skeleton crew, basically the idea is you're only on site if you need to be in the lab. We do have the ability to work remotely with computerized data, but obviously you can't run an experiment from your couch yet, unfortunately. Um, but we're also taking into account, there's some people on site that have the pre-existing conditions or are in the risk groups, and we have the staff to be able to work around not making them come in. So we're definitely taking into account who is in the risk group and who is not, and how we can kind of balance that to make sure that everyone stays safe, but the important work is still getting done. And there's also a lot of coordinating with, we're only allowed to have a maximum of 2 people in any lab at any given time. Um, so there's a lot of like online coordinating of when someone can be on site safely so that what they're doing doesn't interfere with what somebody else is doing. Um, as far as precautions we're taking, everyone is now wearing a face mask on site. We have face masks being distributed daily. They're single use. Um, we're not allowed to wear gloves in common areas. I honestly would not suggest. I only wear gloves outside at the gas pump, and then I take it off immediately and I throw it away. I honestly would not suggest wearing them in the grocery store, just because everything you touch with your gloves, it's just like touching them with your hands. Just wash your hands when you get home, kind of. But then at work, we have we have a couple buildings shut down because they're all like administrative and business, and they can all be done from home. So then we have the cleaning crews being consolidated into specific buildings. Um, Also, I'm lucky in that a few of my labs have UV lamps that we run at night. So they're just decontaminated every night, and they've been doing that as long as I've been working there. And then just the washing your hands. That's actually washing your hands and wearing a mask are 2 of the best things that you can do. Um, that's mostly what I do when I'm home is I wash my hands every time I go out and leave or come back in, every time I open the mail. Um, if I think I touched something that might have been dirty, I go wash my hands. So that's honestly, as a molecular biologist, probably one of the best things that you can do.
I'm so tempted right now. My nose itches, and that's the other thing is that people are saying, "Don't touch your face, don't touch your face." And I'm like, but I want to scratch my face off. So,
So
so
I would say if you wash your hands, you can touch your face. Also, if you're in your house and people aren't coming and going in your house a lot, it's probably not dirty inside your house.
okay. I'm gonna use my shirt.
I've been doing that too.
All right, that makes me feel better. And so that's a perfect example and a good segue into the next question I have for you, which is we're sort of, I think among ourselves we're trading fact. I don't even want to say factoids. We're trading sort of like ersatz facts, and oh well, I read this or I heard that. So
Mhm.
what are a few things that you wish we knew. So a few of the sort of basic fundamental things, takeaways that are going to help us live our lives and do what we can to help flatten the curve.
Mhm. So, one of the big things, and I feel like this is very timely this week and going into next week, is we are flattening the curve currently. We are, yes, it's a good news. We are below what they were projecting if there was no social distancing. We are hopefully near the peak, but that doesn't mean it's time to take our foot off the gas. Um, because then it's gonna flatten a little bit and then start going right back up. So I know a lot of people are going to say we overreacted, we did this for nothing. The death count wasn't even that high, but the death count wasn't even that high because we're doing this. And if we stop now, it's just going to start rebounding. Something else to think about is a lot of the conversation right now is around the chloroquine and I don't even remember. I think it's remdesivir, these antivirals, and whether or not they work and if we should be taking them. And first of all, you shouldn't be taking an antiviral or an antimalarial unless your doctor prescribes it. And second of all, these are band-aids that are going to be used to help the sickest people. We have very limited data right now, but they're not going to just be treating anyone they think might have the COVID with these drugs. It's going to annoy me that I can't remember the name, but I think it's remdesivir, is difficult to make and it's expensive. And chloroquine is very toxic in high doses. As a couple people have found out, I think there have already been a couple overdoses. So, and they both are IV drugs. So these aren't going to be the magic bullet that people are looking for. Um, so we can't put our hope in one of these is going to work and it's going to knock out the virus. Unfortunately, the virus is going to be around in some form or another until we get the vaccine. Now, what we can do from here is we can get it under control and do basic epidemiology, contact tracing, and quarantine once we're through this curve. And hopefully that will hold us over until we get the vaccine. But the vaccine is really the only way that we're going to stop it from propagating and becoming a full blown epidemic again.
So, and I know you didn't say this for this reason, but that just underscores the importance of what you're doing. And I Googled real quick while you were talking, and it's remdesivir.
Remdesivir. Okay.
Remdesivir.
Yes.
So thank you. Okay. So what let me see here. What would you say to people, and this is a little bit of a touchy subject, I understand, but what would you say to people who are skeptical about the severity of the virus and the seriousness of what's going on right now?
So I feel like there's a couple camps. There's people that think that it is a problem, but it's kind of close to like the swine flu we had in 2009, where it's a slightly more deadly flu, but it's not going to be a problem. And we were overreacting. So the H1N1 epidemic in 2009 that lasted for 18 months and had about 300,000 fatalities worldwide, which is still very high number. And the big problem with H1N1 was it really targeted young, healthy adults, which was out of the norm. We're 4 months in and we're at about 135,000 deaths. So about half, a little less than half. And that was as of last night. I didn't check today. Half the deaths in 4 months. So it's a false equivalence. This isn't the flu. This isn't even a particularly deadly flu. The mortality rate is close to 1%, which is 10 times the normal flu. And it's more contagious because somewhere around 50% of people are asymptomatic, but can still spread the disease, which isn't really something we see in the flu. You may be able to spread the disease a day or two before you show symptoms, but it's largely people that are showing symptoms that are spreading it. This is closer to the Spanish flu or the 1918 epidemic. The Spanish flu was actually kind of racist because it didn't start in Spain, but the name kind of stuck. That was around 30 million people died in 2 years, but that was with World War I going on and not much understanding of diseases, let alone molecular biology and vaccinology. Um, so if we didn't have those advances, that's the type of disease we'd be looking at. But we have the advances and the medical capacity to lessen the impact. But we have to put that understanding into practice. So we have to learn from what happened in the Spanish flu and kind of put that into perspective. And then the last thing is, I know there are people still who are saying, I'm young, I'm healthy, I just want to live my life. Um, Apparently, they don't have grandparents or parents or people in their lives that they could pass it to that might be affected. Um, just because you're young and healthy doesn't mean you can't get a severe form of the disease that will land you in the hospital. Your likelihood of dying is much lower, but I have several friends and family members who are nurses, and they're still seeing like younger, healthier people ending up in the hospital. And also, if you're young, healthy, don't get the disease, but you need the hospital, like your appendix ruptures, you break a leg, car accident, anything like that. The hospital's not going to be there. The hospitals right now are almost solely focused on COVID patients. Um, so we want to start bending that curve down so the hospitals can go back to doing what they do, which is partially taking care of all the random stuff that happens to people throughout their lives.
Thank you. That's all really helpful. And as you were talking, I was thinking to myself about something that I heard Fauci say early on, which was, if the curve flattening works, it goes back to something that you had said earlier too. If the curve flattening works, then it will look like an overreaction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of no winning with the people who are skeptical,
Yeah.
because if if it works, then I told you so, we overreacted. And if it doesn't work, well then, or if we don't do it, well then we have a catastrophe on our hands.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know,
Yeah.
yeah. So what have I not asked you, Julia, or do you think people need to know, or would you like to share, that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
So there was one thing I wanted to share, and this is kind of just an aside because I've seen a couple things saying, I've seen people saying, oh, this might be like bioterrorism. I've heard people say this might have come from a lab in China, and also the memes about a guy eating a bat sandwich. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about where the virus comes from, because this happens. It's called a zoonotic disease, which means it's a disease that passed from humans to animals, and it happens. It's where Ebola came from. It's where most flus come from. Um, the virus mutates in an animal and then jumps to another animal. And I'm really sorry to all the people with the bat sandwich memes, but this didn't come from somebody eating a bat. This probably came from something eating a bat and then somebody eating that something. Um, but that goes back to it all goes back to people having close contact with wild animals. So what probably happened was a bat came into contact with, we're thinking either a pangolin or an ocelot, um, and the virus in the bat was just mutated enough to jump into that animal, and then it mutated a little bit in that animal, and then jumped into people. And that all comes from close contact with wild animals. And it's actually something China is looking at right now, is shutting down their wildlife trade, because a lot of diseases come from us sharing close contact with animals that we really shouldn't be, encroaching in their habitats or trading them on the black market. So that's actually where this disease likely came from, was the black market in China. Um,
Yeah,
Go ahead.
thank you. So I mean, I'm tempted to make a Tiger King joke, although I know it's not. I mean, it's not funny, but there is a point to be made there, right?
Mhm.
So I guess my follow-up question for you about this is, what is the takeaway for people, once they do know how the virus came into being when it comes to that close proximity with wild animals?
So the big takeaway is I mean, we're always going to come into contact with wild animals, but it brings back into needing more conservation, less deforesting. So there's a ton of deforesting going on all over the world that's driving animals out of their natural habitats. Most animals don't want anything to do with people. They will run away as far as possible. I don't blame them. Um, but, and that's good because the more contact we have with wild animals, the more likely it is that something is going to jump. And this kind of jump happens, and a lot of times the disease burns itself out. We got lucky with both SARS and Ebola. Um, I mean, there was a ton of contact tracing, there was a ton of isolation, a lot of work went into getting those epidemics under control, but also those viruses just weren't evolved well to spread. So Ebola is very difficult to spread. SARS was not as contagious as COVID. And nature finally hit the jackpot with a disease that's easy to spread and also has the potential for high mortality. And it's actually kind of, it's not funny, but it's interesting. Viruses don't want us to die. So this virus is a mutant even among its own species, because if you kill your host, then that virus is dead too. So this was just a bunch of mutations that were very unlucky, and someone happened to be standing too close to the animal that had it.
But if it's fascinating and terrifying all at once, and yeah, but it really does make you think about the. Even though I was going to make a snarky comment about the Tiger King, it really does make you think about our proximity to animals, and and what the humane thing is to do, and what the right thing is to do when it comes to those kinds of relationships. So thank you so much. I mean, I know we could talk for many more minutes about this, many hours about this. I want to ask you one last question, which is, what are the first couple things you're going to do once the quarantine is lifted?
So I'm going to hug everyone I know for a minimum of 15 minutes. I've already told the people at the gym we're not having class the first day. It's just going to be hugs, maybe a few hip tosses.
I like it. I like it. And if an errant or a stray arm goes around an errant or stray neck, then that's what happens when you hug people.
All's fair on the mat.
I like it. I like it. So Julia Kelly, thank you so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it. If you were able to break down what's a really complex and obviously a really fraught topic, and I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Okay.